When I was 10 years old and in the 6th grade at St. Matthias Grammar School, I organized an insurrection against Sister Mary Louise, which was violently and bloodily suppressed. That cured me at a young age for Irish Romanticism for lost causes. And ever since, I've been looking for the levers of change which lead us to victory, not defeat. So could each of you point to, and I think this is different than a magic bullet, all right? It's more like, where do we start? Could each of you point to some lever of change that if you were a teacher, a school leader, a community person, someone who, having heard all that you heard today, wanted to try to move a school in this direction, what lever of change would you choose as a starting place?
This was actually toward the end of my PowerPoint, and it was just too long. But one of the things that I think is one of the most promising practices that I've seen for every age group is restorative practices. And it's not just a disciplinary tool, it can also be used in your instructional practice. And what it involves is making sure that student voice appears in school every day. I think all of us who are practitioners know that a student can go to school and never be asked an open-ended question for the entire school year. Needless to say, for the entire day. So restorative practices ensures that that happens. And once you get the feedback from the children, first of all, that is a way for adults to learn how to be in relationship to children in a way that's appropriate and restorative and builds community and begins to build the climate that we all seek so that everybody wants to stay in that school.
Yeah, I also think that student voice is really effective. I mean, really important. And I think, you know, as I was saying, I am a big believer in using data, getting people together to use data to reach out to students, find out what's going on. I think that there is a tendency, as people are so busy, right, in teaching and running a school, to make a lot of assumptions about what's going on, why students aren't doing well. And I think when you systematically get together around data and you have teams of people working together, looking at data, asking questions, and then reaching out to students, it forces you to understand what's happening from the student's perspective. And I think that makes a huge difference for students. When a teacher reaches out to them and doesn't just assume they don't care, right, or that they need, or put them in tutoring or whatever, but finds out why are they not coming to class, why are they not getting their work done, that student realizes that teacher cares about them. And whatever the reason, there are a million reasons why students aren't doing well in school, but then that puts them together and working towards the same common goals, and then that teacher can come back to the teams of teacher teams and actually help other teachers support that student too. And so, if I would say anything, it's having that data, but being very structured in terms of using that data as a means to reach out to students and support them better.
Yes, right, on all these. I mean, I don't know that there's one lever, but I do think that culture is the most important thing, right? Culture eats strategy for lunch, as we say, but it's culture, so the question becomes, what kind of culture are you trying to create and in service of what? And I believe that in K-12 public education today, and in higher ed as well, for that matter, but I don't know that world as well, a culture that embraces the idea that we must deal with race as the primary issue in American schools, I think is probably the most important lever for change. Until we embrace and confront white privilege, until teachers understand how their interactions with kids on a daily basis with kids of different races impacts student achievement. And until the entire community recognizes that, I think we're not going to get where we need to with our kids.
Well, that's a good point to bring all of you into the conversation. Why don't we start over here?
I'll defer to her. You go first. Go ahead.
My question is addressed to Karen. I was on the Maryland Juvenile Justice Coalition, Reform Coalition, and we used to meet in the impoverished areas of Baltimore. And it was always a concern about the absence of jobs, absence of opportunities, combined with spending $350 million out of the classroom budget on standardized tests that were dumbing down the school curricula even more. And also because of the research in the ERIC database documenting that gifted and talented programs in low SES schools closed the learning gap, but my experience, especially in Montgomery County, is they wouldn't spend the money on every student. And also research documenting not just the cognitive effects of the Suzuki music method as early as first and second grade that catapulted reading and math abilities, but also research documenting that you could look at the academic record and teacher comments of a third grader and with about a 95% accuracy rate predict a child and family in need of early interventions. But again, we don't put the money there. So my question to you is if you could substitute maybe social workers or some other opportunities for the police in the schools, which is really a chilling vision, and also looking at models such as living classrooms in Baltimore, and eliminating the standardized tests, how would you spend that money?
I think that it's a controversy that we're having in Baltimore City now, whether or not we actually need the security personnel. One thing I'll say in that vein, and I was in a very crime-intensive area when I was a principal, and I would not have been the principal to say, I don't need any security personnel. However, are our security personnel bloated? Absolutely. And was there some taking advantage of in terms of the perception of danger in Baltimore City? Absolutely. I think that in Baltimore City and other districts, urban districts with high populations of concentrated poverty, you have to have some type of behavioral plan, no matter what that plan looks like. I personally think that it should be restorative practices. I'm also, right at this time, investing in a group called Holistic Life that they're bringing mindfulness into the school so children learn how to do their own self-regulation. It's not very costly. Teachers are learning alongside the children, teachers who are very stressed. So there are all kinds of promising practices that can be brought in. And my thought is that as we see these practices embraced, and they can be given the title of alternatives to suspension, because that's a title that educators can relate to. And as they're being embraced, the need for all this heavy-duty security goes down dramatically. I've seen it over and over. I can name schools right off the top of my head where that's the case. And it's just time for us to emulate those practices that are actually working. I hope that was...
My name is Roberta Stanley, and I'm a K-12 public education advocate. Dr. Starr alluded to the issue of politics. My observation is that in 1994, the Congress and the governors resolved welfare reform. The governors went home, looked at their budgets, and what was the biggest expenditure after welfare? Education. So they all started these endeavors, and I call it reformitis. The governors wanted to get credit, so they'd start some reform. Well, we all know it takes more than 4 years or more than 2 years or 3 years to institute reforms. And then they declare, well, it didn't work. So we've all had to carry this nomenclature of failing. You know, most of the funding for education comes from state and local sources. Would you like to talk about the governor's leadership or lack thereof in the endeavor of education throughout the country? Because you've got about 4 or 5 states represented with your experience up there.
I mean, a lot of it is about tone, but money certainly plays a huge role. And you know, so look at what's going on in New York, right? I mean, New York is a fascinating case study right now to see what Governor Cuomo was doing around this rabid reform agenda, and then a complete 180. And I mean, I understand why. I get it, but it's just shocking to me that there's sort of no commentary on it, because what are we talking about this morning? Churn makes a difference. Churn makes a big difference in the lives of teachers and the lives of principals. It's one of the reasons why, you know, when I was fortunate to be superintendent of a district in Montgomery County that has enough political clout that I could basically say to the teachers and the principals, forget about the state, forget about the feds, we're going to do our thing. But I had the political clout. You can't do that in lots of other places. And the governors, you know, can be incredibly powerful levers for change through funding. Also, you know, one thing we don't do enough of, and there's fabulous research out of Chicago out of this, we were doing some of this in Montgomery County, we started, they could and should force various agencies that work with kids to work together. Interagency collaboration is great. We designed a tool in Montgomery County, an early warning indicator system. I won't go into all the details. Very similar to some of the work that Chicago's done, but I could identify as early as the first quarter of first grade whether or not a kid was on track to graduate on time. And then what we did, we built systems within the school system. So principals and central office, they had to organize around that data, but I also had agreements from the county executive, the head of the rec department, the head of health and human services, and then we're going to police to organize around those data. So what the schools that had the highest percentages of kids who weren't on track would get the most services from outside of the school system, and then when we start to integrate our data, then I left, and I don't know, and it's all falling apart. But governors actually could and should be doing that, right? Those are levers they can pull. You can, and I mean, this is like wonky stuff, right? But can your data talk to each other? Right? And do you invest in transactional databases that enable that kind of analysis, because you know who the kids and the families are that are in abject poverty or having the conditions that Karen described. You can actually identify them and organize around them with government-funded taxpayer dollars. I wish governors were doing things like that, but I don't know that they have the political will or the imagination, frankly, to do a lot of that.
To make a comment about systemic tools, one of the ways we were able to drive down the suspensions in Baltimore City, training was not everything, the framework was not everything. We also developed user-friendly tools and data sets that we pushed down into the schools, as opposed to thinking that somehow the schools were going to get all this time to sit down and look through data and see where the kids who were falling through the cracks were. It wasn't going to happen. But the people at central office certainly had the time to do that. And so we started to send out monthly reports that we called school climate reports. And they indicated everything from, students who had been repeatedly suspended, students who were chronically absent, and that gave the principals a guideline as to where their school was having trouble. All the 7th graders have been suspended once each. What on earth is going on? So that you can begin to target your resources. The other tool I just wanted to mention briefly is something called the Climate Walk tool, and it's a tool that I'm reinvigorating at Open Society Institute so that it can be made available nationally. And what it does is look at school climate from a real-time perspective. The individual goes along with this it's just 20 questions, what happened when you came into the school building, what did you see during transition time? And with that information, it was, as I said, real-time information, going back to the principal and saying, your kids are fighting in the back hall at 5th period every day. You know, that's something you can fix in a hurry. So I just wanted to say there are tools that can be devised when you decide what the problem is, and they can be made to be systemic. Now that I'm not there, the tool is no longer being used. Those school climate reports that were going out monthly to every single school in the district are no longer being disseminated. And we have seen, and you see that my data ended in 2014 because the uptick in suspensions was immediate. 2015 and continuing, the suspensions are back up on the upward trajectory.
Can I just say, we've now had 3 people in a row talk about the importance of having data and then giving people the space to use the data to address, their issues and their goals. But from a policy perspective, that is, first of all, not sexy. That is not something that is like the big thing that you're going to do and you're going to make your mark. So that's one thing. And if anything, we're in an environment now where there's a big backlash, I think, to using data. A lot of people are, a lot of people are concerned about student privacy, as they absolutely should be concerned about. But we've also, seen, these big, high-profile, data breaches, and people have a very hard time distinguishing those different realms, and all the protections that exist and how data are being used in a way that improves schools. And I do think there's a lot of, there's a great need for people to understand how important data is and how useful it is. And because if you don't actually study what's happening, you actually could be doing harm to children. And what people think is, if you don't study, they want to keep people from using data, and they think that's neutral. When in reality, if you aren't studying what happens, it's an opportunity cost in terms of learning what works, and then it's doing harm to students when you don't realize something doesn't work.
If I can just jump in on that real quick, it does go back to the culture issue. One of my mantras was always, at best, the data help you ask better questions. Right? At best, they help you ask better questions and use it to name names. And it goes back to what we were talking about before, right? Relationships matter a lot. So if you know that a certain kid is not doing well, who knows that child, who knows their situation, name that name, get to who they are, forget about the averages. And all the stuff that was talked about earlier around collaborative structures, relationships amongst teachers, the data should help feed that. So when the data is not contextualized around the culture you're trying to create, the other systems that you have to have in place in order to actually do something about it, then it's seen as a hammer. It's not seen as something that can lead to that deep collaboration, that kind of rich exploration amongst professionals. Because we too often, I'm sure many of you have seen Simon Sinek's TED Talk, The Why, The What, and The How. If you haven't, you should. We don't spend enough time talking about why. We spend all our time just what we're doing and how we're going to do it. But when you think about why we're using the data as a lever for all the kind of stuff talked about today, it can be very, very powerful. But unfortunately, that's just it's just given scant attention.
Yes.
My name's John Eugene. I'm a teacher up at Baltimore Polytechnic Institute. Hi, Karen.
Hi.
Good to see you. And I'm a researcher working my doctorate at Notre Dame of Maryland University. I'm asking this from the teacher side of me. On the practical side of some of the things you've talked about, Karen, obviously I lived through some of the suspension reduction, right? And then a lot of the research-based policies that have been talked about today, lesson study, common planning time, teacher collaboration. These are all things that I've seen implemented. Obviously, on the ground and inside schools, a lot of the attitude remains unchanged, even when practices change. So during the suspension reduction, we still have school professionals, they're complying, but they're saying, well, since we can't suspend them anymore,
That's right.
with a negative tone, right? Wishing that they could. Right, so there's no attitude change. I'm in a school where lesson study is mandated, but there's no change to the structure of the time that's given to teachers. So it's not appreciated for what it can be. It's an add-on, right? And interestingly, I think related to that ground level material is what both Karen and Josh have said, that you were in positions where when you left, policies changed. right? So I'm just wondering, I know so few of us see this happen, but it seems like there's that real gap between the top vision and the bottom experience. And do we have any thoughts or insights on, however pie in the sky they might be, on how we bridge those, how we make some of those changes stick beyond leadership change?
So yeah, that's the kind of thing that sort of keeps you up at night as a former superintendent. It's like, did I actually have any impact? Right? Was it worth it? So I think that a couple of different things. One is the notion of organizing dual operating systems. John Cotter wrote a great piece in a Harvard Business Review maybe 2 years ago about it. And what you have to do is organize. You're not going to be able to mandate everything and control everything. So how do you incentivize creativity and innovation while also recognizing that some people, that part of the challenge is to shift in the distribution of average, right? You have to take the average person and just make them better. A lot of people just want to follow rules, they need better curriculum, whatever it is. You gotta make that better, a better playbook, while you also create an opportunity for people to do really great creative work. And there's a little bit of cognitive dissonance there, because how do you do both those things at once, particularly when school systems are, and the culture of lots of school systems is that everything should go lockstep. So organizing dual operating systems at a high level, I think, is really important. But the other piece I think that's important is messaging and culture. So going back to the reduction of suspensions, we did that in Montgomery County, right? And I was really, really proud of the 50% reduction that we got. And part of it was, I framed it all by using Michelle Alexander's book, The New Jim Crow, right? It was all about the why. Like, it wasn't about reduce suspensions because we need to reduce suspensions. It was what happens when you isolate black and brown kids, particularly black boys. Like, let's look at the pattern. And I hope, and if it's not the case, please don't disabuse me of my, fantasy around this. What I know happened is because I did not give them the playbook, there were a number of schools that did incredibly powerful work because they got it, they understood it, and they understood I wanted it also. I mean, it was clear, like, I expect this to happen, but how they were going to do it was not. I wasn't going to mandate that. And then there were the people who didn't do that. And how do you have to tolerate both, right? And you have to tolerate both, and then you have to use those people that, when given the permission to do amazing things, you have to highlight and recognize them and use them to train others so you can pull others along. But you have to tolerate that. The challenge, of course, and look, this is part of my downfall, was not mandating the specifics of what everyone else was doing, then gave license to the politicians to say, well, make everybody else do that, when you can't make everybody else do that, because there are principals that came up with some amazing things that in no way could I have mandated, but I did make it very clear about why I wanted them to reduce suspensions. It's just a really tough political sell, frankly.
When he spoke of having dual systems, I think you also have to have an inside-outside game, because when I left my school, the same exact thing happened. Which was like, it was like a divorce. It was like, you're sending my best teachers where? You're doing this to what? You're getting rid of the court? There's no bank anymore that students are running? Amazing things were happening there, and they were all disappeared, seemingly intentionally. And that's also what happens in a dysfunctional system. People are only looking at the things that are on fire, so to speak. So these other things get swept under the rug, even though they're changing students' lives, in this case, for the negative. So in my own case, the thing I'm looking at right now is community schools as a way of instilling best practices and seeing them replicated. They will live beyond, between, after, with existing administrations. So I'm very pro-community schools. There are 54 in Baltimore, which is a nice, solid piece, chunk of community schools. And so some of the practices that have gone away that were best practices, they can be instilled in those community schools, and then let's see how we can spread them.
So I'm Laura Triana. I'm kind of a bridger with both a lot of research background as well as practitioner experience, more in developer work. But I thought what you said, Joshua Starr, about social emotional learning was a really important key, because a lot of the current measures of social emotional learning is all self-report, which is very much impacted by increasing the amount of awareness about the importance of self-report to make it look like social emotional development actually goes down when you make it more discussed. And so finding other measures, and I think your example of the school climate measure, that is more of an observational measure as opposed to a self-report measure, which is more common, was really powerful. And I think it's one we should really work towards as researchers, trying to help build those systems that will be reliable and can be used by practitioners to impact and improve their schools. So thank you.
Thank you.
Over here.
Thanks. I'm Tina Collins from the UFT, and I really appreciated this panel. I'm a sort of a policymaker. I'm involved with the PROS program, which is the one Linda mentioned in her talk, where teachers at very collaborative schools actually have the opportunity to propose tweaks to the contract or to city regulations. It's been very successful. In less than 2 years, we have 126 schools signed up for it already. But I think one of the things we've struggled with, and I'd love to hear all of your thoughts on this, is what is the most effective message to elected officials and to policymakers around this question of why is it so valuable to have schools that are highly collaborative and places where many voices are heard and where those voices actually have a say in the policies that affect them? Because I think a lot of people appreciate that in principle, and then when you actually say, well, where's the funding for it, right? Like, where's the funding for additional time? Or, where are the better measures for giving schools credit when they're highly collaborative versus just value added or something like that? People be like, oh, well, that's nice, but it's actually this other stuff. So I was wondering if you had, from your experience or from any other thoughts about the most effective way to get that message across that this is something valuable.
I just want to say one thing, which is that also, although I talked about the Baltimore City context with 85% of our children living in poverty, when you look at the national data, it doesn't look so much better. 51% of our children live in poverty. So I think that one of the things we have to do is have lawmakers understand who our children are and what they're up against. If they don't understand the why, they're not going to go forward and try to cut new ground. Most of our schools look just like they did in 1945, which is absurd. So I think that it's incumbent upon us to really study who are these children in our classrooms and what are their needs. And that has to be part of everything we talk about when we're asking for change.
So I don't know that I have a great answer to your question, but I'll attempt it from a couple different angles. So one thing is, don't ask for money. Well, I'm serious, right? I was never superintendent in the good times, right? From Stanford through Montgomery County, I was never during times of a good budget. And you learn how there's a more stuff attitude that lots of folks have. Well, I can only do this if you give me more stuff, right? And in fact, incredible creativity can be unleashed when you're forced to do things without more money. Now, you need supports. I mean, you need supports. I am amazed at the variety of skill level amongst elementary principals, in particular, principals in general, around scheduling. Now, and scheduling is really tough. Some are really, really good at it, and some aren't. And you can do amazing things if you can schedule well, and how come we don't organize school systems so that principals get the help they need to schedule right? And it sounds, but there's a whole bunch you can do without that. I was able to negotiate in my contract, the contract with the teachers in Stanford, and I had to go to arbitration over this, a staggered schedule for certain specialists, because my thing was, well, why don't our reading specialists or social workers come in later and stay later and things like that? Interestingly, lots of folks really didn't want to do it because it just went outside their view of what should happen, that everything should happen from 8 to 3. But you can do things like that that are no cost. So one thing is, don't ask for more money. The other, and we haven't talked about accountability today. And there is this absolute, there's this, the evidence is such that we know all this stuff we've been talking about helps improve schools, but at the end of the day, who is accountable for a child not achieving at the level they need to? And is a team, if you're going to get the support for team-based work, well, is that team willing to be accountable and be held accountable for the 20 kids in 4th grade who still aren't reading on grade level, right? And we're not talking about that enough. And I think in the political realm, we have to say we are willing to embrace the responsibility we have. And the other thing is, just don't start any conversation with what the research says, right? The easiest way, I mean, look, school board members, parents, they don't go to AERA. They don't read Kaplan, right? The mayors, right, there are other publications, but I'm only going to talk about Kaplan.
With the mayors, you can stop at they don't read.
Well, but some are really thoughtful. And Leo said that, not me. So I think, though, you got to realize who you're talking to. And the flip side of it is state legislators, I will say, are incredibly receptive to teachers and principals and everyone else. We don't do a good enough job of telling our stories. What we do is complain a lot about what we're not getting, and there's valid complaints, but there isn't enough attempt to tell stories. I made a point as superintendent of bringing people into schools all the time so that I could then have the teachers tell the stories about how they were doing the work, and that's what changed my mind. It's harder than than some of the other stuff, but in fact, that's what a lot of folks respond to.
Okay, I think Ellen had her hand up, and that would be no?
Well, I was going into you were being very practical, and I understand what you're saying. I was responding to your point about who's accountable.
Let's get a mic. It'll be easier for you and us.
Who's accountable when a kid's not on grade level? And my hand shot up because I keep thinking, what is grade level? And why are we still doing that? And why is it that children can develop at different rates when they're young? This kid walked when they were 12 months and this kid walked when they were 9 months is okay, but when you're 5, you have to be the same. And so in some way, our school systems eventually have to hold standards as the constant and time as the variable and not keep doing this. And then who's accountable? We all are collectively. But the paradigms we keep using to describe our kids, it just gets a reaction, and it's not practical.
I'll restate, right, and by whatever measure you use, right, there needs to be some accountability. And you're right about grade levels and whatever else. And I think the collective responsibility thing, it's always at the end when you have the most fun discussions, right? But I think the collective responsibility thing only goes so far, right? I'm having experience now with my 7th grade son. One of his teachers just stinks, right? And it's just not good. And they're doing a lot of work to try to move this person along, but it's just not good. And you know what? That person's accountable, right? Should be accountable for the fact that they're just not serving any of the kids well. And that's not about the rest of the school. I know the school's working at it, but there's we talk about collective responsibility. Yes, absolutely. But in order to shift the narrative, and that's what I started with, in order to shift the narrative and not continue to have these polar opposites that currently exist, we've got to be willing to embrace that middle ground here that says, yes, there needs to be individual and collective accountability and responsibility, and we need to invest in the kind of architecture and infrastructure that has been so eloquently described today and the research that's been done. And we've got to, David Hume said, truth springs from arguments amongst friends. I'm so afraid that right now no one's even speaking to each other. We actually need to have those arguments about it, and we got to have that kind of accountability along with all the supports. All right, good.
Okay, so let me say the following. First, when I gave due credit and honor and glory to Esther and Vicky this morning for putting this all together. Vicky was hiding out somewhere. She's now in the room, so you can all give her. She certainly deserves credit for making these events run on time. And we now are prepared to transition into the social. And Al Shanker thought that he had a second vocation as a small independent business owner. And you may not realize it, but this hotel you're in is actually part of a complex that includes the AFT building and the building of the American Federation of Government Employees, and it's actually union pension funds that have the majority stock in this hotel. All of which may be irrelevant, except for the fact that it's very easy to transition to the space where we will do social, which is you can actually not even leave this building, just walk down the ramp to your right and take an elevator up to the 4th floor in the AFT building, and there will be refreshments, both alcoholic and non, and for those of you who are planning to dance, there will be space for dance. So let me thank you all for coming, and I hope that we will see you again in the future at similar events.